Today I'm going to tell you the story about Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And I'm excited to tell you the story. How Rudolph was created was one of my favorite Christmas histories. Rudolph's an icon. He's always been an icon my whole life. He's right up there with Santa Claus. But I was amazed to learn that Rudolph didn't exist 32 years before I was born. That's when he was created. And he was created by a department store, Montgomery Ward department store. So it's a very unique story, and I'm excited to tell it to you. To some of you that know a lot of history, you might not be surprised that a major company could have such an effect on one of our Christmas characters. You may be aware that sometimes Santa Claus is called the Coca Cola Santa Claus, because before Coke started marketing with Santa Claus in 1931, Santa looked much different. And I'll show you some of the pictures of Santa then. The Rudolph situation's a lot different than what happened with Coca Cola. Coke's one of the greatest marketing companies in the world, and they always have been. They decided they were going to market with Santa, and they had some of the best advertising minds in the world working on creating Santa's image. Rudolph's a little bit different. Rudolph wasn't created by an advertising department. They weren't created by a professional advertiser. Rudolph was created as a simple cost-cutting campaign. The same type of thing that happens in businesses all across the United States every single day. They had an issue, they figured out a way they were going to cut some costs, and they created Rudolph out of that. It's very interesting. Rudolph also, he wasn't an advertising campaign, he was a giveaway. He was essentially a Happy Meal toy. They were trying to drive people into their stores, and they needed something that they could give to kids, and so they created Rudolph. We'll get into Rudolph's story in a little bit. Before we get into this much deeper, I want to talk a little bit more about the Montgomery Ward department store. Because if you're like me and you grew up in the 80s going shopping with your parents, you probably went to a Montgomery Ward department store. They were in, half the malls in America in the 1980s. But they ceased to exist at the end of the 80s, and a lot of our audience probably has no familiarity with Montgomery Ward. So I want to give you a little back history on them. Montgomery Ward was started in 1872 by Aaron Montgomery Ward. He had this idea that people would want goods shipped directly to them. He was especially thinking about all the rural people in America, the farmers and the people that lived in small towns, that they couldn't get to the big cities and get all the goods that were available to the people that lived in the cities. So he thought if he could just take those goods and ship them directly to people, at that point they could pick them up at the train station, but eventually they would be shipped directly to their house. He could have a very successful business. So you may think Ward's concept sounds a lot like Amazon, and it really did. It was a revolutionary idea, and it changed the world. They soon became huge. They had major competitors like Sears Roebuck and J.C. Penney, and these were the original catalog companies, and they could get you whatever goods you wanted in a matter of days. It was revolutionary. So how did Ward start out? He started with something called the Grange that you may not be aware of, but the National Grange is an association of farmers. It's a nationwide association of farmers. And Ward got in with them, and he said, hey, tell your farmers that I can get you these goods. And he handed out a little flyer, said, these are the things we can ship you. Now that was in 1872. By 1899, Ward had 2 million customers, and his little flyer had grown into a catalog that was up to 1,000 pages. I'm going to show you an example of that catalog. So I don't have an 1899 Montgomery Ward catalog, but I did find the next best thing downstairs. I do have a 1902 Sears Roebuck catalog that was left to me by my grandfather, and it gives you the idea. It's the same kind of thing. We said Montgomery Ward had 1,000 pages. This one has a little over 1,100 pages, and if you look through here, boots, feather plumes, just everything you can imagine, tombstones, china cabinets. There's a lot of stuff for driving horses. It's kind of similar to Amazon. You could find just about everything you wanted in this catalog. So, Montgomery Ward was a catalog company, but I already mentioned they had a lot of competition from Sears Roebuck that we just looked at there, also J.C. Penney. So what happened was they were all looking at getting into brick and mortar. So in 1926, Montgomery Ward built their first stores so people could actually come in and see the merchandise firsthand. By the end of the decade, they had 500 stores available, and getting people into these stores was the reason that they invented Rudolph. I do want to emphasize how important Montgomery Ward was to the United States at the time. We're talking about 1939, just before World War II, when Rudolph was created. In 1944, just 5 years later, there was a potential strike with Montgomery Ward's 12,000 workers, and it was so important to President Roosevelt that he was trying to work with Montgomery Ward CEO Sewell Avery at the time, and Avery wasn't cooperating. So President Roosevelt told him he was going to seize all of Montgomery Ward's properties nationwide. And that actually happened. There's a famous picture of that in Chicago in 1944, where the federal government, the soldiers go in and seize the Montgomery Ward property, and Avery's still not cooperating, so he's carried out by soldiers. So it's an interesting little tidbit, and it shows how important Montgomery Ward was to the economy at that time. Now I want to get back to the direct story of everybody's favorite reindeer. So in 1939, Montgomery Ward had an employee named Robert L. May. He went by Bob. Bob was in his 30s. He was a highly educated Ivy League grad from Dartmouth, and he had hit some hard times in the Great Depression, like a lot of other educated men at the time. I think he'd been through about 5 jobs, and he lost his job in 1932. In 1936, he moved to Chicago with his new wife, and they had a baby, Barbara. And he got a job it was a low-paying job as a copywriter for Montgomery Ward. Now, Bob was a little bit depressed at the time. He'd grown up in a fairly affluent household, so he was used to having money. He didn't have a lot of money. He was not making a lot of money, and his dream was to write the great American novel. But instead, he had a job in Chicago writing about men's buttons on shirts for the catalog, and that's how he put it in his own words. He wanted to write the great American novel. Instead, he was writing about men's buttons. So in January 1939, Bob's boss had an idea to save the company some money. See, Montgomery Ward had been giving out coloring books to little kids at their stores all across the country. But they weren't buying the coloring books on a national plan. They'd just go to the local peddler and say, hey, we'll buy these coloring books, and they'd give them out. And they thought they were overpaying for the coloring books. So his boss had a great idea. He said, if we write our own story, print it up nationally, and send it to all the stores, we can save a lot of money. So he came to Bob, and he pitched the idea to him, and he gave him one piece of advice. He said, I'm thinking of an animal character, something like Ferdinand the Bull. Now, I don't know if you all know Ferdinand the Bull, but it's a fairly famous story about a bull who liked to lay under the trees and smell flowers when he was supposed to be a fighting bull. He was a Spanish fighting bull. He didn't want to fight. He just wanted to lay around and smell the flowers. Now, this is a big deal at the time because Ferdinand the Bull was written in, I believe it was 1935, hit the press in 1936, and hereby a couple of years later, it was outselling Gone with the Wind as one of the best sellers in America. So it was a big deal, and I'm sure that Bob's boss thought, hey, this guy's talented. He can write a story at least as good as Ferdinand the Bull. So Bob was pretty excited about the idea. He started thinking about it right away. He knew it had to be about Christmas. He knew it had to be about an animal. Right away, he started thinking about Santa Claus, and he definitely thought about the reindeer. Everyone knew Santa Claus had 8 reindeer, so that made sense. He also knew his daughter Barbara loved deer, so he thought that Barbara would just love the story about a deer. So he had an idea that it wanted to be a deer, but he didn't know what the deer's problem was going to be. And so he was looking out of his office window in Chicago, and the fog rolled in off of Lake Michigan, a heavy fog. And he could just see the lights peering through that fog off the street lamps in the city. And he thought, you know what? That's what it could be right there. Rudolph could have a big red nose that glowed, and that glow would cut through the fog and allow people to see. He was pretty excited about that idea. He'd even come up with the name Rudolph by then. He went through several R names and decided he liked Rudolph. So Bob was really excited at this point, and he brought it to his boss, and he told him about the reindeer with the glowing red nose that cut through the fog, and he thought this would be a great story. And his boss looked at him and he said, "For gosh sakes, Bob, is that the best you can do?" So May's boss probably had a point when he was concerned about the original presentation of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer with the big red nose. See, you have to remember this was a few years after the end of Prohibition, and there was still a lot of concern in this country about alcoholism. And Big Red Nose was well known at the time as being a sign of an alcoholic, and it was kind of a joke at the time. People made fun of the Big Red-Nosed alcoholic, and it probably wasn't appropriate for a children's book. So Bob May had to do something to persuade his boss a little differently. So of course Bob was kind of crushed, and he went back to the drawing board and he was trying to think what he wanted to do. But by now he really believed in this Rudolph idea. He knew he could make it work. He thought it was going to be a good story, and he just had to figure out a way that he could convince his boss to go with it. So he came up with a plan. One of his good friends was named Denver Gillum. He was an artist with Montgomery Ward. He worked down in the art department, and Bob walked down to the art department, and he said to Denver, "Denver, do you think you could draw a picture of a deer with a big red nose and make it cute and likable?" And Denver said, "Yeah, I think I can do that." So that Saturday, Bob got his daughter Barbara and Denver. They all met at the deer exhibit at Lincoln Park Zoo, and Denver sketched up some deer. And Bob was pretty happy with what he saw. Took it back to his boss on Monday morning and showed it to him. And his boss said, "You know, Bob, forget what I said. Go ahead with your plan and get it finalized." So everything was back on track again. Now this started out, like I said, in January of '39, but Bob's wife was very sick with cancer. Her in-laws had come to visit. It wasn't going well, and by July, his wife had passed away. And obviously, Bob was torn up by that. He went into work, and his boss came up to him and very gently came up behind him and put his hand on his shoulder and said, "Bob, if you don't want to go on with this project, I'll put somebody else on it. Why don't you give me your work and we'll have someone else finish it up for you?" But Bob started thinking about it, and he decided, in his own words, he said, now I needed Rudolph more than ever. So that's how he dealt with the grief of losing his wife. He sat down between July and the end of August and just buried himself in his work. And the Rudolph book, the poem, was actually written from July and was completed by the end of August. In 1939, the Montgomery Ward gave away 2.4 million copies of the book, and it was generally considered a very successful giveaway. Now, there was a paper shortage as our country headed into the war, and they were not able to give out the book for the next several years. But in 1946, when the war ended, Ward gave out another 3.6 million copies of May's poem, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Total 6 million copies, and they probably would have been done with the story, done with the book, done with the poem at that time, except for something special happened. So Robert May, even though he didn't own any rights to the book, his name was put on there as the author. So May was contacted in 1946 by RCA Victor. And some of you old timers know what RCA Victor is. For the youngsters, I'll get into that in a minute. But RCA Victor was going to make a record, and they wanted the rights to May's story. when they contacted May about getting the rights to his book, May knew he had a problem. He didn't own any of the rights at all. It was entirely owned by Montgomery Ward. So what happened next is a little bit unclear. By most accounts, either Sewell really liked Robert May and just out of the good of his heart wanted to give May the rights to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. It sounds like maybe some of his co-employees went to bat for May and said, why don't you give the rights to this poem to May? And Sewell agreed that at the very end of 1946, actually January 1st, 1947, May would have the rights to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Now, that really isn't very surprising. It was a poem that they wrote internally. They'd given out 6 million copies. Sewell probably didn't see a lot of value in the poem. And in fact, a lot of publishers at the time didn't see any value. When May got the rights to the book, he approached several large publishers, and they all basically said, why would we want this book? You just gave away 6 million free copies. Who's going to want to buy a copy? May couldn't find anyone to publish the book until he found a small publisher in New York by the name of Harry Elbaum. And Elbaum agreed to do 100,000 copies in hardcover, which it hadn't been given out in hardcover before, and those sold fairly easily. So they knew they were in business at that point. But I do want to get back to the RCA piece, because really Rudolph, the book may have been dead at the time if it wasn't for RCA jumping in. So what was RCA Victor trying to do at the time? RCA Victor had been selling for decades something called the talking machine. And I actually have a talking machine, or a Victrola, in my house. I want to take a field trip and go down there and show the youngsters what that is, because it is a neat machine and I think it's important to the story. But they were selling records for these machines, and it was an entertainment for kids. And it wasn't always music. Sometimes it was children's stories. So RCA Victor had started a little series, a children's series, and they had done the book. Raggedy Ann was one of the characters they had. They'd done a story about Cinderella. They'd done Rumpelstiltskin. They'd done Aladdin, and they wanted to add Rudolph to their collection along with some others. The Little Engine That Could was in that series as well. Children would buy the book with the records in it, and they could play and hear the stories on their Victor talking machine. So we'll take a field trip now and go take a look at it. So this is my Victrola. It's a pretty cool instrument. It doesn't run on any electricity. If you're not familiar with this, I'm going to take a few minutes to show you how it works. There's a little cabinet in the front here where you can store all of your records. It sticks a little, it's old. Here's our Rudolph record, and I'm going to show you how it plays. So the lid lifts up and locks this way. It's pretty simple. You get a crank. This thing just runs on a spring. You wind it up. You have to wind it for a couple seconds to engage it. Okay, you can hear the spring winding. This is pretty simple. You probably give it 30 cranks. There's just a brake. The brake's the only thing that stops the turntable from moving. You'll hear when I engage the brake, it squeaks a little bit. Okay, you have to put a new needle in for every record that you play, because an old needle can actually damage the record if it gets rounded off. So we set a new needle in there and we tighten it up. Okay, we pull out the record, set it on the turntable. Now you control, I don't know if you can see it, I'm going to move this a little bit. You control the volume by opening the door. When the doors are open just a little bit, it's muffled, you won't hear it as loud. When the doors are all the way open, you're going to hear it full volume. So we're going to go back and start this record. Before I do that, I'm going to move the microphone closer to in front of the record so you can get a full experience. Here's the Rudolph record. Side 1.
A long way from here, and in that whole forest lived nothing but deer. just as fish live in water and bells in a steeple, and round where you live almost everyone's people. There were mother deer, father deer, baby deer too. To keep from collisions, we'll have to fly slow. To keep our direction, we'll have to fly low. We'll steer by the street lamps and houses tonight, in order to finish before it gets light. Just think how the boys' and girls' faith would be shaken if we didn't reach them before they awaken.
So I think the work with Victor and making the record of this story, which was just a talking story, segued Rudolph into his next big success. If you look at the Sambo story, you can see there's a second offering that was musical. So I think that kind of put the idea in May's head that Rudolph should be a song as well. A lot of these children's books were also being made into songs. So the huge break is that Robert L. May had a very, very talented brother-in-law, and his brother-in-law was named Johnny Marks. So Rudolph's next break came from Johnny Marks. Johnny Marks was a very talented songwriter, and he'd recently married Robert May's sister, and he would later go on to do such top hits as Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree and Holly Jolly Christmas. So he was very talented, but his first break was when May came to him and said, "Can you write the song to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer?" Now, he hadn't had a lot of success at the time. He was a young guy. But after writing the song, he was so confident that he had a hit that he put up $25,000, which was a lot of money back then, $25,000 of his own money to start a music publishing company because he knew this Rudolph song was going to be a big hit, and he wanted to make sure he had all the rights free and clear. Marks was also the one that convinced Gene Autrey to sing the song. The story goes that Autrey wasn't super excited about it at the time, but his wife was, and his wife wanted him to do it. Turns out Autrey's wife was right. 12 million copies later, Gene Autrey's singing of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer is one of the top-selling Christmas songs of all time. I don't need to go into a lot more story. I mean, we've went from conception to Rudolph well on his way to being a big hit. Rankin and Bass did a television special in 1964 that I grew up with and many people have grown up with that certainly launched Rudolph a little farther. The neat thing about that is Johnny Marks did the music for that, and everybody remembers the beautiful Burrell Ives songs. Those songs were also written by Johnny Marks. So Rudolph was well on his way, and the rest was just history.